Good day, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the IDRiM podcast. Today is a continuation of our previous episode where Dr. Harris interviewed myself about my recent book chapter on the cognizance of climate change within the United Kingdom. Today, we're going to talk a little bit more about communication of climate change and what governments could be doing to fix climate change. We hope you enjoy today's episode.
Well, in terms of language and how the IPCC or the scientists communicate to the publics, we'd like to pivot a bit from our discussion here
Mm-hmm.
as people researches climate change. The main, for me, the the main danger for the climate change is everything's become more uncertain. The uncertainty is rising throughout the roof. Well, this could be the simplest explanation is basically yes, the earth is warming, we have hotter summers and we have warmer winter, for example, but as it is the uncertainty, it's mean that the range of the temperature in the summer and winter is it grows larger. It could be some areas will face very hot summer, and some areas, oh, the summer here is very cold. I mean, while and the same one for winter. Some with, oh, the winters now it's really warm. It's not really cold anymore. We don't see any snow, but there's some areas like, for example, in Japan last year, so like in Kyoto, I mean, like predominantly doesn't have snow much. And last year, in last winter, which is from the end of last year and the beginning of this year's, Kyoto faced so many snows, which is like, okay, it's not it's different. It's not warmer winter, but it's like that. Uh, in terms of the language and the convincing people that actually it's happening. What do you think? What can you recommend for these people to actually to communicate these things? Because that's the challenge, isn't it? In that communicating uncertainty as the main danger of the change that we face right now.
Yes. And it comes back to that word you keep repeating, uncertainty. What does uncertainty mean to the public and what does it mean to us? Uncertainty means that we can't, the general trend goes one way, but there's a little bit of wiggle room. Uncertainty to the public just means we don't know. And that's the biggest and hardest thing I think we've not fully grasped yet is actually how do you communicate that uncertainty? I think that the area that has really had a harder job of trying to communicate that has been North America. So if you want to take that, you just said about, snowfall, let's take the US. The US has had arguably a number of severe winters now in a row. Much colder, a lot more snowier winters. How do you communicate that that's climate change? Well, that's a lot easier because of that term. But that's where the skeptics say, well, you've changed it from global warming to climate change to fit that term. Yes, kind of. Because the reason why that is happening is because the atmosphere is becoming destabilized and it's allowing polar vortexes from that typically sit over the North Pole south. As a scientist, we know that. But how do you communicate that? And I think the way to stop communicating climate change is that the way that we portray climate change now is that everything's getting warmer. But yes, but it's not always getting warmer. And I think that that's where I would say climate change is weather chaos because it makes the weather more chaotic. We know that we know that we're going to get extremes. We know we're still going to get snow in Europe, heavy snowfall, very heavy, really cold winters. The frequency is going to decline, but when they do come, they'll be still pretty bad. Literally, the one to look at right now is who having a hard job to try and understand this is Australia. Australia, literally 2 weeks ago, had its heaviest snowfall in 40 years. How do you, Now, for an outsider, talking about snow on Australia is a bit of a weird, thing to tie together, but that is difficult, and that is, that's just happened. And one of the reasons is that I haven't gone into it, but it's probably that same destabilization event. So the way to describe it and the way you communicate is that the trend is it's getting warmer. However, the weather is more chaotic. That very simple, but it's true. Is it getting more chaotic? Yes, it's dry. The summers are drier in the UK and Europe, and they're warmer. It doesn't mean it's going to be warmer every year. You could have where I lived, was it last year or the year before? The summer, I think it was last year. Everyone said, "Oh, what a miserable summer." It had been very, overcast. We hadn't had any of them big peaks we've had, in recent years. It was very overcast. And then the Met Office came out and said it was the warmest July on record. Everyone's like, "Oh, it's a lot of rubbish." The reason was the top temperature wasn't very warm, but the night temperature was. Because it was overcast, the heat couldn't escape. So we were getting every night the temperature was 15, 16 degrees near tropical weather. But because the temperature wasn't getting above 21 or 22, which is pretty average for where I live in July, it means that it didn't feel like a hot summer. It just felt a normal, dreary British summer. It was only hot because of the lower temperature, and the Met Office couldn't convey that. But it's the warm nights that were the problem, because if you have a summer night, its basic concept, if you've got a cloud, it traps heat. It's basically it's the one greenhouse gas you can almost see. If you've got a cloud at night, it's trapping all the heat. So therefore, it's like the carbon dioxide and all the others. But you can see it, and that's the perfect example of I use it to explain. How do we know that there is a greenhouse effect? Well, it's that one. But going back to your original question about how do we communicate it, I don't think we've actually fully worked out yet how to fully communicate it. I think the best way of saying it is just that the weather be more chaotic and the increases of extreme events is going up.
Well, talking about chaos, you also write about the tipping points. Is the terms tipping points will have in this matters? I mean, like,
So,
what are these actually, and how they do matter in the climate crisis, emergency, and change here?
so there are two tipping points.
Hmm.
So there are climate tipping points and there are social tipping points. So it's almost the social tipping point is borrowed basically off the climate tipping points. The climate tipping points, for anyone who doesn't know, are basically where the climate has reached a certain stage where it's irreversible, the damage that's already been done. So, for example, I'm trying to think of a good one right here. The North Atlantic ocean patterns. Right now, the North Atlantic ocean patterns, the circulation is slowing down. We know it's slowing down. The reason it's slowing down is because large amounts of fresh water are flooding into the North Atlantic Bay, ocean. Saltwater, freshwater don't mix very well. So therefore, that circulation is slowing down. A tipping point, an environmental tipping point, potentially for the climate, is if it stops completely. What happens then? Well, that ocean circulation is there to moderate the temperature of the planet, cool off the equator regions, and warm up the going up subtropical towards the Arctics, towards the poles. So in the UK, we would see temperatures, easily -20, -30 degrees Celsius, with heavy snowfall events in winter without it. I think a lot of people forget is that the UK is actually at the same latitude as Moscow, Russia. And there is big differences. Now, there's little other differences in terms of, land warming up and cooling down faster than the sea. There's that, but we would still see huge differences in our winter. So there's the environmental tipping point. Now, what my paper talks about is actually social tipping points. And social tipping points there are time periods in social history where people's opinion changes in a way because of an event usually that changes it almost, without where there is no coming back, either for a short period to a long period of time. So in the paper, I talk very much about in the UK, what we see is that using the Eurobarometer data from 2008, 9, 11, 13, 15, 17, and 19, is that we see this, discernible decline in concern of climate change. How how people, in particular young people, are concerned, view it as a serious problem. Now, why was this? Well, I said it started in 2008. What happened just before 2008? Well, and around 2008 is the big point. There were two events to do this. One, very much is economic. So therefore, that means that you get you have the finite pool of worry. So that means that you can only focus on one concern at a time. So environmental issues start falling down as a concern. The other one is very much around 2009. So what we see is that this is 2008. So we already see that decline, but in 2009, we also see the outbreak of, ClimateGate. So ClimateGate is very much about the decline. Was a leak of emails that was dressed up by certain media, in particular the Daily Mail, to say that climate change, to make it look like that we were manipulating the data. What will that do? That will decline the concern again. So we've got that concern. Now, what happens is that we start to see in this data another tipping point. Around 2030, after 2013, we hit rock bottom. 2015, 17, and 19, it goes up and up and up again. And the reason is that we have, first of all, the climate gate, the economic crisis have started to go away, but the weather's got more extreme by this point. So therefore, the concern, that extreme is another tipping point. Now, as I said, the data only cut off in 2019. 2019 is probably the high watermark, in recent years, because from other data that I've observed is that in 2020, the concern drops off again. What happens in 2020? COVID-19. Doesn't mean people are not concerned about it. It's just that they don't believe it as a big concern anymore. So, and that's that finite pool of worry yet again.
Well, as you touched upon this, is basically, this is just a masquerade. If I mentioned that in my wording that some big events that should distract people of the ongoing crisis or emergency that's happening all around us, because it's just slow onsets. It's happened gradually and it affects almost everything. It's like, and you mentioned earlier about the food supply problems will be very big in the future, in the near future, I guess, because all the harvest will behave erratically, where it can be people try the food security will be treated as much from that, because like you just don't know. I mean, like how to get the food anymore at the certain times, and it will happen gradually. That's why, like, now it's the main concerns, the food, as it's one of the very important thing in our lives. And another thing is basically, if I remember correctly from the not National Geographic article several years ago, or even last year's, that now it's the climate is changing. People try to move toward the north, because like for example, Sweden and the Nordic is basically a very cold, and like it's getting warmer, which is like it's not so cold anymore, and it's livable to live there. The barren lands that team. Oh, it's no people should be living there because it's too cold now. It's getting warm. And looking at this, especially the last one that I mentioned, do you see any change in human populations, or there will be any other migrations? Well, especially by the rich that try to have a house in, well, will be more comfortable climates, like in the 10 or 20 years later, because like I
Mm.
guess the poor will be difficult to move out because they don't really have any choices or options to go there. Probably the one with wealth will go there because they have the capability to do so.
Yeah. So there is data to suggest that's happening already. So we know from the European Investment Bank's data from survey from 2023, when they did survey a select number of African countries about climate change. One of the things was that there were a number who were thinking of moving, because of these extreme weather events. Or so we're already seeing people thinking about that. There is a debate in the literature that how much of a role climate change played in the Syrian civil war, and we know what happened next on to the European migration crisis. So I think that it's an issue that's already here. I think that this is an issue that when we were talking with Professor Wren about polycrisis, this is what I was trying to hint to him, was that the climate crisis is going to lead to a migration crisis, which is going to lead to other crises of governments and breakdown of trust in institutions. One could argue that the UK is facing that moment right now. So in the UK, we are having a huge row about migration again, and migration is now the number one concern in the UK. And we have literally across the country now, people are putting a protest against migration using the flags. They're literally flying the flags to say, this is Britain, and that's an issue. If it's building its tensions are building underneath the surface. What the parties are doing with the right wing parties, they're saying they've got this like anti-climate mixed in with anti-immigration, which really is going to be a toxic mix because if you don't fix the climate, you're going to have more immigration. So you've got this, and actually, if you look at the National Rally in France, the new leader understands that. He is very much about trying to fix climate change because he says fixing climate change will address the migration issue. So it's gonna be a very painful, I feel, and I really hope not, but I feel that there's gonna be some real pain coming because people are moving further north because Africa, Middle East in particular, are becoming more harsher, to live in. And you want to live in more comfortable conditions, and no one can be blame people. But then you've got those who are from those countries not wanting them in. And where do you put them? When you come back to the question about island nations who are drowning, basically, Tuvalu, the Maldives, where are you going to put them? And how are the people who are already living in those countries going to feel about another group of population coming in? They should be welcoming, and that you would hope they're welcome. I would hope people would welcome us in if we were in that crisis, but I fear they won't, and that's my biggest fear right now. And I think that what the climate crisis or climate change is doing is it's fueling other crises of social matters rather than not just environmental matters. And I don't know. I'll be honest with you, I don't know how to fix it because you've got this dangerous feedback loop where you've got anti-climate change to anti-migration, which leads to more chaos, and it pushes. So basically, at the minute, the climate change is pushing an anti-migration movement, which is putting more right wing governments and more extreme government policies, which are driving more anti-climate policies. which leads to more migration, to more anti-migration, and you can see that negative spiral where, like, where do we get off here? We need to, you know what I mean, and start fixing one of them. Fix the climate one to stop the feedback from getting worse and worse and worse, and we're not doing that.
Well, I mean, like, the conservatives should choose to conserve one of their values. Either you don't want to be anti-migrations or you don't want to be anti-science. But I guess the best one to solve it all is just stop denying science and accepting the science, and then it solves everything.
It would be the easiest option, but
Yeah.
sadly, I think that the horse has already bolted out with that one, out that stable, because I think they've gone, especially a lot of the right wing ones have gone that far down the rabbit hole. I don't think you can't see how they get out of it.
Well, I mean, like, this kind of problems, actually, many people say is also, even that, as you mentioned, that old people try to rephrase it. This is not my problems. This is the problems next generations. And now, regarding of the next generations, it's been like young people will be involved a lot on this. And as you mentioned, explained roughly and several minutes ago, that now the influence comes from the social media. So how this well, we discussed this a lot when we discussed another of your papers before, but like, let's emphasize again how the youth people, young people, perceive the climate change right now, and how this influence with many different medias will influence their actions, and how can we ensure that our future is safe in these young generations.
Young people are generally more, agreeable to climate change, but obviously that agreeable bit is because of the education sector. Now the education curriculum in the UK is a bit, it's complex, so the government of the day will get to decide the broad areas of examination, what needs to be talked about. So they could, one day could pull all the climate science out and say, if you're not that a teacher, then where do you educate them? Now, the good thing about in the UK, in a quirky way, is that our education sector is basically privatized. It's state-funded private education. So basically, it's organizations, trusts that run, every education facility, nearly enough now in the UK, and therefore they get to decide what they teach. Now, obviously, we don't know what's being taught in these ones, but we know that generally there is a pro-climate. So they are generally, they come out of school and, they know that they know broadly what climate change is, and they're very pro-climate. Whether they know a lot of details about climate, that's another debate we can have. What I'm concerned about is social media not particularly giving a good viewpoint on climate change. And it comes back down to, in the UK, I'll give an example. The BBC, it's meant to be fair and unbiased. It's the question, how do you cover climate change in a fair and unbiased approach? Because the very definition would mean you have to give equal from both sides of the argument. How do you do that?
Well, you cannot do. I mean, like, you need to take a side anyway.
But then that goes against its charter of why it's there. And there's been legal cases of this and a lot of argument, because you're supposed to be balanced, unbiased. The education sector is supposed to be the exact same thing. That's the Education Act of 1998, I think it is. Where you're not allowed to put political viewpoints. Climate change is very political, and it's very much how do you do it. So you got this really awkward mix is why we can't teach a lot of it. But because it's meant, so you got this really awkwardness about how do you get, how do we communicate? Now, a lot of young people are online, and they're getting that more balanced viewpoint where should it really be that balanced? Because 99% of climate scientists believe it's this way. That's about as, I would say, it's about as many people who believe that, you know, the Earth is round. Does that mean that we should have, you know, teach that the Earth is flat? Of course not. Now I'm being very flippant, you know, on what my analogies here. But this is the issue. And what young people are viewing online is they're viewing alternative views. Now, if they're not being taught alternative views in classrooms to, you know, dismiss it, are they, you know, are they going to start believing the alternatives? And that's my concern. And the social media companies just won't take them down if they're factually incorrect, because it's under the guise of freedom of speech. So it comes to that line, is that not only about balance, where does freedom of speech end and the truth begin? And do you have to regulate freedom of speech so that lies don't get perpetrated? And we've had this debate. I know we've had this debate before, where about, you know, how do you stop this misinformation? And, you know, do you treat them as publishers so that then the platforms have, you know, really feel like they have to? And this debate's really a big, you know, debate actually happening in the UK about freedom of speech versus freedom of truth right now.
Is there any easy way for them to adopt, or it should be go to the hard way and like learn everything's understanding everything, then goes to the public?
I think what they need to do, basically, the way that the policies, the politics have been going on for years, is they've gone for the easy route. They've gone for the easy decisions. They've gone for the short-termism approach. So the easiest ones, you know, was, which was the biggest emitter? It was, you know, coal, our electricity grid. It was terrible, our electricity grids. What's the easiest way of doing it, the cheapest way? Gas. So switch to gas. You know, so we've gone for the easy route. It's all well and good doing that in the short term, but the UK has now facing has been facing for a few years now the energy crisis, because that didn't work. What I think the UK needs to do is just go hard and fast now. I think what the UK has been doing for a long time is, imagine if you've cut yourself and you've got elastoplast and you're trying to pull it off. It's more painful pulling it off slowly than just ripping it off and ripping the problem, you know, getting rid of the problem. I think so. The UK is trying to be net zero, its electricity grid by 2030. So in 5 years, it's going to ban petrol cars in 5 years, in less than 5 years. So, you know, it's going quick. I feel that what the UK is not doing is it's put all the investment drive in the areas, you know, in some of the areas, but it hasn't done it in the right areas. What's going to stop it from being net zero by 2030? What's the problem with renewable energies? Where do you store them when you've got too much? And when you have too little, what are you going to do? Well, there's a kind of a middle answer there. Some sort of battery system, you know, to bridge the gaps between the two. The UK has virtually nothing like that. Spain has more in natural battery systems using rivers, you know, dam and rivers, than we do in anything in the UK. So there's a problem straight away. We do a bit of it in Scotland with hydroelectric, but not that much. So we don't do that. What's going to be the biggest stop of getting people to get into full electric cars? One, apart from the cost, obviously, but the other one is, how are you going to charge them? Are we literally going to have 100 cars on the M25 motorway trying to get into a service station to top up on electricity? That's not going to be feasible. So you're going to need them in local communities, and they're not ready. So the ideas, the concepts of what needs to be done, going hard, yes, but that needs to be topped up with infrastructural development, and I don't feel that governments around, and that's what I think is holding up a lot of progress, is infrastructure. And I think that's where the previous administration in the United States recognized this. They recognized that infrastructure was going to be the key to unlocking potential. I think that what we're doing in the UK is putting infrastructure in, but we're being too this thinking of electricity for a second, because that's the key of all of it. We're putting too much on actually the generation of electricity, not the storage of electricity. And that's the big issue. So right now, one of the ideas is to mandate for every household, from new household by next year, has to have solar panels on. All new households getting built from next year have to have solar panels. Fantastic. Less loss of electricity through transmission lines and all that. But that doesn't address what happens when there's too much electricity on a sunny day. So we've had days in the summer this year where we've had over 130% of electricity, most of which is from renewables. We can't turn the nuclear power stations off, even if we wanted to, because we need them at all times. So basically, we're turning off the solar panels, we're turning off the wind turbines, and it's costing a fortune to do that. So what the government should be doing, and no government wants to borrow, but it should be borrow to invest in the secondary part of the infrastructure, which is storage. Now, that could be, as I said, via batteries. It could be, using these big Tesla battery farms that they've got, in Australia. It could be using old batteries from cars. We could use old car batteries and do it that approach. Or the third one, which is not very, and Demi's going to love this. So Demi is a good friend of ours. Is use hydrogen as a reserve fuel. By chance, hydrogen also is a good fuel for putting into the gas supply with a very small tweak. So you could actually heat homes with it. So you could use the electricity to convert into heat in homes. So this is what governments could be doing right now. It's probably cheaper in the long term than what we're doing right now. We won't have to buy all the gas in. Fantastic. So we don't need no gas for electricity or for gas supplies. And we won't need petrol or diesel because the electricity would supply the cars. Doing that would wipe out about 3/4 of the UK's emissions. Just doing them, very. I'm talking in a very simple way. It's a lot more obviously complicated, but you can see how unlocking these secondary infrastructural developments actually will make big differences. And because we're not importing gas from Norway or LPG now from Qatar and the United States, it'd be a lot cheaper as well for everyone. Everyone's bills would go down. And this is not a pipe, this is not me, saying that, it's in the sky pie idea. These are all getting used already. And actually doing all that, and if we can get to net zero, we wouldn't need carbon capture and storage. Really, we wouldn't need much carbon capture and storage at all, because if we can balance the net zero, all the countries, then the Earth will eventually start absorbing that carbon back. And we can use the most basic way, plant trees, to get the excess.
Yeah, as they said, the best time to plant the trees is 100 years ago, and the second best time is now.
Yeah. Well,
so it's the last questions.
Yeah, that's
sorry.
one of the, I just want to add to that is one of the things that I think that we also forget is on the climate crisis. We keep saying it's burning fossil fuels, etc. That's only part of the story. The other part of the story is actually how we use land. So the UK used to be just one big forest. Has a few forests, not very much left. So I mean, the UK, okay, different type of tree, but was very, very similar to Sweden. North Sweden, Norway, Ireland. I think when I see Ireland, I very, very rarely see a tree. It's one of them things where it looks, very barren. But that used to be loads of trees on the Isle of Ireland, and all them trees absorb carbon. So, and Scotland has recognised this. So there are Scotland is rewilding itself because of this very much. And Scotland is trying to get, let's see if they do it. They want to be net zero in 20 years. And rewilding is going to be a part of that plan.
All right, then. All right. So for last questions today is, finally, for our listeners, all of our listeners, put researchers and everyday citizens, laymen, what's one piece of advice you'd give for making sense of all the climate change informations we hear today?
So I would say that try and keep it simple when you're trying to communicate climate change. Climate change it's difficult to get your head around. It's because some of it's very interlocking, and then some of it it goes against what you would naturally think would happen. So literally some of the things that, trying to fix climate change, making, fuel more expensive should make people, drive less. But all it did was made the companies make the fuel cheap, make, the cars run cost cheaper, and people drove more. In the end, they actually end up driving more and using more fuel. So there are, so some of it is very, it gets really complicated. I think I would say communicate simply is number one. I think try and communicate in a way that people understand and it aligns with people's concerns. So if you are, so thinking of where I live in particular, so I live in the northeast of England. It's a very high levels of deprivation, low levels of higher ed, university attainment. It's also very famous for its heritage of its coal mining. So there is not climate change doesn't exactly is not the flavor of the month up here. So if you go through what I said about university attainment, kind of foreshadows a lot of a perception. Coal mining, climate change don't really mix. So the levels of concern with climate change is a lot less. Plus, the northeast of England is very much sheltered from the worst of the impacts. So most of our storms come from the west. So by the time they hit the Pennines, the mountains of the Pennines usually have died out a bit, so we don't get the worst of the damage. It would only ever happen if the storms came in from Norway and Sweden, is when the worst damage happens. Also, we're in the north, so it's a lot cooler up, usually a lot cooler up here. So we don't get the worst impacts of climate change. Is more of a, as we mentioned earlier, a farther away issue. I think in that case, then is how do you communicate to them about climate change and the transitions? You don't. You just ignore the climate change question. You look at, well, what are these these communities' concerns and issues? Now, if you look at in some places, so where I'm from, Middlesbrough, its historical name is Smoggy because the area was very highly polluted. In them areas, you would say, well, aren't you worried about the damage to your child's lungs or your lungs? Now, if you drove an electric car, you will reduce that amount of emission. Now, if everyone did that, you'd live longer. And also the northeast of England is the poorest region in England by quite some way. So if you say, well, if we start putting solar panels on roofs and we put wind turbines here, it brings cheaper electricity. People then will take a more favorable view. So it's about, and it's one of the things that we learn, when we're going through university, you'll have learned a little bit of it as well. If you did quantitative research studies, the phrasing of the question will give you the answer you're looking for. That's why we have to try and do it in the most balanced way we can, because it's easy to phrase a question in a certain way that gives the answer you're looking for. It's almost the same way in trying to persuade people, you look at what these people are wanting, and then you phrase it in the way that they want it. Because a lot of the issues, but a lot of the fixes to the climate issue actually fix and unlock other other issues, and try and put other issues like poverty, like emissions and health. They actually will fix them issues as well.
Well, I guess the takeaways, it's basically soft climate change, will solve to this problem and brighten your future. So that's it, Mark. Thank you very much for sharing your latest publication with us. And hopefully many people will read it. It's very interesting for all of you. And we will put the link for you all to get it and read it. And see you next time.